Alright, I am back with another video, and today we're doing something that I've actually wanted to try and do for a long time, but could never make it work in a way that felt satisfying to me. However, thanks to new additions to the game from a couple of patches and a couple of mods that are available to both console and PC, I was finally able to make this concept work. Now, this originally started out as a build based around Flame Blade, and Flame Blade early I was going to make sort of a pyromancer sword dancer, which I will make in the future. However, as I was kind of working my way through this, I kind of realised, wait, I can throw Shadowblade into the mix and finally make the dual summoned swords build that I've been wanting to make for a very long time. I had a few caveats, like me and Shadowblade have had a very, let's just say, spotty history. I've gone from loving it to hating it to loving it again, and now I'm kind of in the place where, like, now that we have more ways of getting Shadowblade, it is a pretty damn amazing spell. And now that it is way more versatile and accessible, thanks to Mistress Spells mod, we are able to kind of get a lot more use out of it. For example, it's not tied to just being once per long rest via a ring. We can actually have it as part of our regular spell list, which is a huge boon to this build. And being able to combine it with Flame Blade with some equipment-based shenanigans is going to make this a very fun build indeed. However, before you guys start, I am going to say, yes, I know that there is an exploit to get a permanent Flame Blade in this game. I am not going to be using that exploit because I like to avoid using somewhat complicated exploits where possible. I know this one isn't the most complicated, but whatever. As well as the fact, just in case it gets patched, but as well as the fact that I don't really want to use the permanent Flame Blade because it cannot be upscaled, and I do actually want to have the ability to upscale this Flame Blade for more damage. So, there you go, before someone inevitably comments it. Help, someone's probably going to comment it anyway, I can't stop you. But regardless, we are going to be able to work with the new kind of spell lists that we have, with some fun equipment stuff and some multiclassing to get the most out of both Shadowblade and Flame Blade at the same time. And trust me, it's a very fun combination. So, without further ado, let's get into the build. We're going to be kicking things off by playing as a tiefling today. Why? Because when I think of fire and darkness, I think of tiefling, so we're going to be going with that. And it actually is going to help by giving us fire resistance, which is going to be very useful later. It's also going to give us regular dark vision, as well as the standard movement speed. I've gone for an Asmodeus tiefling today because I wanted to play as a red tiefling without, you know, messing up the lore by just changing the skin color of a different tiefling. You know how it is. But it is actually going to give us some useful things, namely the Darkness and Hellish Rebuke spells later on. Darkness is going to be a fun spell to have anyway for this build, and being able to use it without a spell slot is going to be quite fun. I haven't specifically built for like Devil's Sight or the Eversight Ring here, but the ability to slot those things in pretty freely on this build is going to be great if you want to do some darkness stuff. Although obviously we are going to be wanting to concentrating on Shadowblade most of the time, but if you want to just make use of Flame Blade and not Shadowblade, then being able to sub in Darkness instead is going to still kind of give you the same vibe of the build generally, but just with a different strategy. But it's also going to give us Hellish Rebuke, which is a nice fire spell to have, which we're not going to get otherwise. So I went with Asmodeus, but any racial combination will work. You just might want to make sure you get fire resistance somehow on this build, whether you get that from your race or maybe a piece of equipment later on, but I feel like Asmodeus Tiefling is a good place to start for this build. For our starting class, we are going to be a Paladin today. Now, this is going to be a Sorcerer build. We are going to be mixing Paladin and Sorcerer together. Sorcerer being a Charisma spellcaster as well as Paladin means that we're going to be able to use Flame Blade a lot more effectively with our main spellcasting stat. However, the reason we are starting with Paladin and not Sorcerer is because I want heavy armor proficiency with this build, but I also want to get to level 7 of Sorcerer for level 4 spells, as well as level 5 of Paladin for extra attack. So there's not really a way to fit like a 1 level dip into something that would give us heavy armor on this build. So while we're not going to be getting Constitution saving throw proficiency on this build, which does suck, we are still going to be able to maintain concentration quite easily because, yes, I did kind of cheat and use the Amulet of Greater Health, as you can probably tell by our stats on the right. However, I will be showing some like alternate ways you could kind of do this build, but you're probably going to have to use a stat boosting item somewhere to get the most out of it. And the Amulet of Greater Health does make the most sense because concentration is going to be so important for maintaining Shadowblade. So, Paladin is going to be our starting class here, again for the heavy armor proficiency because I wanted heavy armor. If you want to go with medium armor, then actually you could start with Sorcerer, and you might have some better luck with that depending on your armor choice, but I found a piece of heavy armor that I really wanted to use, mainly for the fashion, but also for its effect. I mean, just look at this character looks awesome, so I do want to go with Paladin here, but feel free to change up this build as you see fit, as with all of my builds. But starting off with Paladin will give us things like Lay on Hands and our Channel Oath charges, as well as Divine Sense, which is great, and we get to choose our subclass. Now, for your subclass, it's kind of up to you what you want to pick here. Any of the subclasses will work, although I feel like Vengeance, Conquest, or Oathbreaker do make the most sense overall. I'm personally going to be going with Oathbreaker for this build, because it's going to give us some stuff that I'm going to want to go over in a minute, and it's going to kind of fit the theme of the build a little bit better, at least in my opinion, so we're going to be going with Oathbreaker in a bit. I'll do a crime just in a second, and I can show off the level 1 features there. So, next up, we're going to look at our ability scores. And yes, obviously, as I've already stated, Constitution is at 8 because we're going to use the Amulet of Greater Health to bump that up. In the meantime, I would recommend maybe going for, like, maybe bumping down your Charisma slightly and going with something like Constitution, bumping it up maybe a bit here, because we are going to be using Dexterity for the most part if we're using Shadowblade. But if you want to focus more on the Flameblade stuff to start, then maybe I would bump your Dexterity down and keep your Charisma up, just to kind of patch up that Constitution a bit. I think you'll want this at least around the 14 range to start, otherwise you should be just fine, because if you just start with Flameblade, you don't need to maintain concentration on that, so it might be worth sticking with Flameblade in the early game with a slightly lower Constitution, and then picking up Shadowblade later once you're able to patch that up. I don't know, it's up to you. The only thing that is going to feel a bit awkward about this build is as you play the game figuring out where to put those stats to get the best use out of everything, but I feel like most people will be able to figure that out at this point. There's tons of different ways. I mean, hell, just throw on the Gloves of Dex, and then that's no longer an issue at all. So feel free to play around with the stats in the early game, but these are the final stats you're probably going to want to work towards. Strength is at 8 because we don't need it. Intelligence is at 10 because we had some extra points, so you could put those into strength instead if you want. Wisdom is at 14 because it's great for saving throws that could potentially break concentration, and Charisma is at 16 because it is our main spellcasting modifier. Dexterity is at 17 because we have the opportunity to bump it up with a half feat later. However, if you want to swap your Dexterity and Charisma scores here, you could go for a Charisma 17 and bump that up with a half feat later instead, if that is what you choose to do. Entirely up to you, but I use Fey and Shadow Touched a lot in these builds, so I wanted to swap it up and use a different feat that I've not shown on the channel before, so I think it'd be quite nice to pick it up for this build. Right, I'm going to do a crime real quick, be right back. Alright, now that that's settled, we now have our level 1 Oathbreaker feature, Spiteful Suffering. This allows us to target a creature, they have to make a Charisma saving throw, and basically the target will take an extra 1d4 necrotic damage each turn, and attack rolls against it will have advantage. A nice overall buff for the build. Now, of course, the whole point of this build is to use Flameblade and Shadowblade, so I'm going to want to get those as quickly as possible, so we're going to multiclass out of Paladin straight away, unless you want to go to level 2 for Divine Smite, but I think I want to get our main weapons first, so we're going to jump straight over to Sorcerer. Now, obviously, with this build, we're not really going to be getting Shadowblade or Flameblade until around total level 4, which is a decent way into Act 1, unless you know specifically what you're doing. So you're probably just going to want to pick up, you know, some basic short swords, basically play this build maybe like just a regular sorcerer, just making attacks with cantrips, and your average kind of level 1 spell selection. So you're going to be playing this as a sorcerer in heavy armor to start, which is not exactly a bad way to go. You'll be perfectly fine, but once you pick up those swords is when this game is really going to start to feel, like this build I should say, is really going to start to take off. So with level 1 of sorcerer, we're going to get to choose some cantrips. I'm going to recommend some fire starters, namely Fire Bolt, because, you know, we want a fire cantrip, we're supposed to be using fire, as well as Green Flame Blade from Mistress Spells. Again, available on all platforms. Green Flame Blade is going to allow you to attack with your sword, dealing extra fire damage. This will do more fire damage as a base as you level up, but if those enemies happen to be adjacent to each other, the attack will move over to another target, dealing a little bit of fire damage there. Also, you get to attack with green flames. It looks very, very cool for like a Darkflame type deal. I'm also going to pick up Booming Blade as well, because it can almost function as like a way to buff Shadowblade as well. Even though we're not dealing psychic damage, Thunder is ambiguous enough to kind of look the same when you actually cast it. I don't know. But Booming Blade is going to feel really fun. You get to deal extra thunder damage, and if an enemy moves willingly while they're after being attacked by this on their next turn, they take a little bit of extra thunder damage as well. Very, very fun condition overall. And finally, I'm going to slap Bone Chill on here as well, giving us a necrotic damage cantrip that can prevent targets from healing, which is a very nice feature to have. We're also going to get to pick up a couple of level 1 spells. Obviously, I want Shield. It is one of the best early game spells, as well as Chromatic Orb, just for some generic option for dealing multiple different types of damage with a ranged spell. You can also pick up Magic Missile if you want instead, or Chaos Bolt if you're feeling a bit spicy, but I always like Chromatic Orb as a safe and reliable option. We also get to choose our subclass, and we're going to be going with Draconic Bloodline today, and going with a Fire Ancestor. Entirely up to you which of the 3 Fire Ancestors you want to pick. Brass would give you the Sleep spell, which has a ton of different uses. Gold would give you Disguise Self, which is always fun in social situations, especially since we have high charisma. But we're going to be going with red for Burning Hands, because Burning Hands is a tiefling spell anyway, and so I want to include it here. And I absolutely love picking this specific scale pattern. It's been a long day. And going with this kind of like purpley red hue, I just think it looks really nice on this build with this specific character design. So yeah, I'm just going to go with that for the design. At Sorcerer level 2, we're going to get Meta Magic. But we're also going to get another level 1 spell at this point, and I always like to recommend Absorb Elements as another great reaction-based spell for if you take elemental damage. So Shield is free if you're going to get hit by an attack roll, but Absorb Elements is great if you're going to get hit by something that's like an AoE, like Fireball, in which Absorb Elements will allow you to take half damage from that attack, and then deal an additional 1d6 of that element type on your next attack. It's a great overall defensive option for times where Shield is not going to work, so I recommend picking it up. We're also going to be able to use Meta Magic here, being able to grab Twin Spell to be able to target two creatures with a single casting of a spell, but we're also going to be grabbing Extended Spell, which I don't take very often, but is going to be extremely helpful to us. Because Extended Spell extends the duration of any spell we cast, it means Flame Blade is going to last longer than 10 turns, and so is Shadow Blade. Because Shadow Blade, when we take it as an actual Sorcerer spell, and it's added to our spell list naturally, not the version from the ring, it only lasts 10 turns, same as its tabletop counterpart. So with this, we're going to be able to extend the duration of both Flame Blade and Shadow Blade for those longer fights. So I think it's pretty essential for this build, as long as you remember to use it, unlike me. I always forget about the meta magics whenever I play a sorcerer, and I don't know why, I'm just dumb like that. But yes, Extended Spell and Twin Spell are going to be great, I would definitely recommend them. At this level, you're also going to be getting Hellish Rebuke as well from your heritage if you play as a tiefling. So yeah, you got a lot of options here. And finally, at Sorcerer level 3, Character level 4, we gain access to level 2 spells, which means we get to pick up Flame Blade, and by replacing an earlier spell, in this case it is going to be Absorb Elements, just because I think I prefer having Chromatic Orb, because I just like it a bit more generally. It's less situationally Chromatic Orb is more situationally useful, I should say. I'm flubbing my words a lot today. But anyways, we're going to take Shadow Blade here. So this version of Shadow Blade is the exact same as the version from the ring, except it lasts 10 turns. But it only costs a bonus action to cast, which is nice, so you'll be able to set it up quite easily. Finally, we also get to choose another Meta Magic option, and it's entirely up to you what you want to take here, because Quicken Spell is okay, but since we're mostly focusing on the, like, summoning sword spells, we're going to be using our bonus action to summon them regardless. So, in actuality, we don't need Quicken Spell if we're just focusing on that side of things, so you could take something like Heightened or Subtle Spell if you want, but Quicken Spell is generally useful, but since if we make an attack with our action, we can still cast spells with a bonus action if we want to. However, despite saying that, we're going to be able to make 2 attacks with our bonus action or our main action by the time this build is done regardless, so Quicken Spell might not have as much use to you, unless you get that extra bonus action from the Pyro Quickness hat, spoilers, we're using that, and then being able to cast a spell with a bonus action after making a bonus action attack, so that's 3 attacks plus a spell. Yeah, actually take Quicken Spell! At level 4 of Sorcerer, you can go into this straight away and take a feat if you would like. I think, though, I would recommend going back to Paladin and starting to level that up. We do have a pretty solid stat spread. Yes, we do have an odd score here, but for the most part of the game, this is going to be fine, I think. If you really wanted to, you could bump this up with the Hair of Anti-Ethel if you feel like this character would go down that route, and I would say this character is probably somewhere on the neutral part of the alignment chart, so it's something they might very well do. So I would say that you could go with that and just have a solid stat spread overall and go back into Paladin here. But obviously, if you want to take the feat at this level, bump up with that half feat feat, you absolutely can, but I think I'm going to go back to Paladin, because I feel like that progression will feel nicer, especially now with the fact that we have our weapons. We can use Divine Smite, granted from level 2 of Paladin, as well as we're going to be able to give ourselves a fighting style. Now, you may notice that we don't have 2-weapon fighting here, which may have you thinking, well, that's a problem because we're dual wielding. It's actually not, as long as Shadowblade is in your main hand, because Shadowblade is the only one that's actually considered a weapon, you'll be fine. Because while wielded in the offhand, Flameblade is still just a spell attack. It's just a melee spell attack, meaning that it doesn't actually add any of your attacking modifiers to it anyway. It's just flat spell damage. So even if it's wielded in your offhand, you don't actually need 2-weapon fighting to wield it at its full capacity. You're still going to be able to. So you don't need it at all. Which does beg the question though, what fighting style do we take instead? Well, if you're not bothering with Shadowblade, you could grab dueling, but again, since it's a melee spell attack, it doesn't actually count as a weapon attack, so dueling doesn't work with it. So really the best option for you here then is defense, which is just going to give you an overall defensive buff with a +1 to your armor class. Hard to say no to that. At this point, we're also going to be getting the Darkness spell from our racial choice as well, and we do get to prepare some Paladin spells as we have unlocked Paladin spellcasting. Now, the obvious choice here is Searing Smite for the flavour. If you don't use Shadowblade all the time, this is a great way to add extra oomph to your Flameblade, giving you more fire damage at the cost of your concentration and your bonus action as well, but you can upscale this and just go for a big flame-based Nova Smite, which I think is quite fun. But we can also pick up Thunderous Smite as well for a cool thematic smite with the Shadowblade too, as this one doesn't take our concentration and can potentially push targets away and knock them prone and hit them with extra thunder damage. But of course, even more fitting, there's Wrathful Smite, which doesn't unfortunately work with Shadowblade because it also takes your concentration, meaning that Shadowblade will go away right away, but you can still use it with Flameblade if you like. Then finally we can pick up Command because it's a useful non-concentration based spell, and then finally for your last spell, I mean, it's kind of up to you. Most of these take concentration, and really, we do want to keep our concentration on Shadowblade if we can, so Cure Wounds can go here. At Paladin level 3, we're going to get our subclass features, namely the ability to control undead, as well as Dreadful Aspect to frighten nearby enemies. Very fun effects. As well as we're also going to get Hellish Rebuke added to our spell list anyway, so yep, we're going to get Hellish Rebuke without needing to use a spell slot, and Hellish Rebuke with our spell slots subsequently. So we're basically getting Oathbreaker stuff, adding on to our racial stuff to just get access to these spells more frequently, and it feels natural. That's why I liked Asmodeus Tiefling for this build, because it just feels like Oathbreaker and Asmodeus Tiefling were just meant for each other. It just feels so thematically appropriate. But also we have Inflict Wounds here, which I'm going to be honest, you're probably never going to use, but hey, it's here. There's also the option to take another spell at this point. I mean, Ceremony is one of the only non-concentration options that we have here, so sure, why not? Let's do some weddings. At level 4 of Paladin, we are going to get to choose a feat. You have a few options here. You can put, obviously, a couple of points into something like Charisma now, if you want to bump that up to 18, especially if you use the Hair of Auntie Ethel to bump this up to an 18. You'd have a pretty well-rounded stat spread at this point if you went down that route, and to be honest, now that I'm thinking about it, that's probably what I would recommend more. But I wanted to do something different with the feat selection here, and I wanted to test and see how powerful this actually was, if it made a difference in the long run. I scrolled right down to Resilient, and I took Resilient Dexterity. Now, why would I take Resilient Dexterity on this build? What do we gain from proficiency in Dexterity saving throws? Well, I've come to find that in a lot of my combat encounters where I do my testing and some general playthroughs of BG3, Dexterity saves are kinda nasty. Big AoE spell damage, and especially if you're trying to concentrate on spells, can be a bit of a pain in the butt. Now obviously Resilient Constitution would help a bit more with that, but Resilient Dexterity, allowing to basically half the damage from a lot of spells in the game, feels really good. This totally isn't because I wanted to use a completely different feat before realizing that none of our attacks deal slashing damage. That's totally not the reason at all. 100%. Moving swiftly along onto level 5 of Paladin, where we're finally going to be getting our hands on extra attack, as well as level 2 spells from our Paladin spell list, including Crown of Madness and Darkness. See? Told you Tiefling was made for Oathbreaker. But anyways, Crown of Madness, I should say, is actually a very nice spell to have as well. Yes, they're all concentration, but hey, it's nice to have options. Also, we do get to pick up some more spells here. Definitely going to grab Aid, as we'll actually have a 5th level spell slot by the time we're done with this build. And since we can't upcast Flameblade or Shadowblade to level 5, we can only go like every 2 spell slot levels, so level 4 would be the highest. We can actually spend that 5th level spell slot on Aid, as such getting a big dollop of extra hit points, so it's worth taking. As well as you can take whatever else you like. If you want poison resistance, grab protection from poison. Moving back over to Sorcerer, we're going to start picking up some stuff from there. Namely, we get to get another cantrip. It's entirely up to you really what you want to pick here. I think we've got most of the things that I want to get with this build, so I mean, it's another fire spell. We can get Create Bonfire. No, that uses concentration. Probably not the best option. Larluck's Minor Drain can help us recover some hit points. Yeah, you know what, we'll take that. It's a necrotic spell. It's fun. We also get to pick another spell up to level 2. And it's up to you really what you want to pick here. Like I say, we got most of what we kind of want already. If you want to take the darkness part a bit more literally, you could go for blindness, which will allow you to blind a creature. Attack rolls against it have advantage, and then it attacks with disadvantage. Could be fun. Non-concentration would work for some strategies. There's also, if you want a different summon sword option, the Summon Moonblade spell, which I've used a few times, which would definitely fit with this build, as you can summon a fire or ice sword that would deal bonus fire or cold damage, increase your armor class by 1, and give you resistance to the damage type that you picked. It's kind of a straight upgrade in a lot of ways to a lot of the summon sword spells, but I do think it is a little bit powerful, so I've decided to leave it behind for this build, even though I've used it in the past. I would say I might go back and actually grab Absorb Elements again, since I made a case for it earlier, but we did train it out, but I do think it can be quite useful overall as a non-concentration utility spell. You also do get to pick up another feat at this point, and I'm going to say, let's go back and grab some more Charisma. At Sorcerer level 5, we're going to gain access to level 3 spells. And yeah, we're going to take Fireball. Come on! You're not playing a fire build without Fireball. At Sorcerer level 6, we're going to get access to a bunch of goodies. We're going to be getting Elemental Affinity damage whenever we cast a spell that deals the damage that is fire type. We will be able to add our Charisma modifier to that damage. So now our Flame Blade is getting our Charisma modifier added to it, which is nice. We're also going to get one of the worst features in the game, Elemental Affinity Resistance, which allows you to spend a sorcery point when casting a spell of your chosen type to gain resistance to that damage type for a temporary amount of time. But we have fire resistance anyway. And most other cases, this is never worth for using. Just never ever use this feature. It's so bad. Like, I'm so glad 2024 D&D fixed this and just by giving you the resistance permanently. Next up, we do get to pick a level 3 spell, and I actually do think Counterspell is a really good and reliable option in this build. Sometimes shutting down a very damaging spell which could cause you to break your concentration is just one of the best things you can do with a build like this. So I just think Counterspell just being an overall reliable option is something that I would definitely like for this build. Finally, Sorcerer level 7. We can grab our level 4 spell of choice, and thanks to the 1D&D or the 2024 D&D spell list revisions mod, which is again available on all platforms, all mods used will be linked in the description, Fire Shield gets added to the Sorcerer's spell list, meaning that we can now use Fire Shield to cast a aura of fire around us, damaging anyone who gets close and attacks us with fire damage, which is going to stack with some other features that I'll be getting into in a minute, but I really wanted to include this on this build. If you don't think that Fire Shield is necessary, then feel free to drop this level of Sorcerer, because we don't really need it if you're not going for Fire Shield, and throw in something else. Maybe that level of Fighter for that con proficiency, if you want to go down that route. You could go for maybe a level in Wizard if you want to do some spell scroll learning, if you know how to manipulate the stats right. There's a bunch of different things you could do with that extra level, so feel free to play around with it a bit. See what you can come up with. And that is the build. Don't look at me so judgingly, Oathbreaker Knight. I know what I had to do. But anyways, yes, that is the build. And overall what you're going to be getting out of this is, well, It's the summoned swords. It's a build that everyone has tried to make work, at least in some ways. Some have succeeded, many have failed, but being able to finally combine Shadowblade and Flameblade in a meaningful and fun way, again with the ability to upcast Shadowblade, making it a lot more powerful than normal, it just feels so good to use. And yes, I like this build. I think it works really well. There's a lot of cool theming to it, and again, at the end of the day, we are a Sorcerer. We could be using a bloody stick and we'd still be one of the most powerful builds in the game, but the fact that we get to throw in such interesting flavour and distinct damage types between using weapons made of pure fire and psychic damage does just make it a lot more interesting overall. And we just have so many unique and interesting abilities to go with it, being able to inflict frightened, being able to retaliate with fire damage automatically, being able to heal ourselves for a decent chunk of HP, and we even have access to strong ranged attacks through things like firebolt and the like. We have a lot of options available to us. We've got an absolutely amazing hit point pool to just be able to tank things from outright. So yeah. And we even have meta magic for just even more versatility. So overall, I think this is probably one of the stronger builds I've made. Obviously, it does have the caveat that if your concentration breaks, then you're not really using the Shadowblade side of things. But even then, the Flameblade side of things alone is more than enough to make up for it. So if you happen to drop Shadowblade, well, you still have Flameblade. Because if your Flameblade's in your offhand, then you cast Shadowblade. If your Flameblade is in your offhand and then Shadowblade runs out, it automatically goes to your main hand anyway, so you don't have to faff and finagle with all that. So yeah, that's pretty good. But I'll quickly summon the two swords in question. So as you can see with Shadowblade, deals an additional 1d8 psychic damage per 2 levels, so upcast it to level 4 with 3 to 24 psychic damage. Same with Flameblade, upcast to level 4 for an extra 1d6 fire damage. This is where Elemental Resistance Affinity comes in. Disable that in reactions. Right. This allows us to get our following two weapons. Let's enter turn-based mode real quick, so that they don't run out. So first up, we have Shadowblade. It's actually on our offhand. You might have to swap that around in combat if you can. Maybe you'll summon the swords before you actually get into combat, and that'll help you out. But Shadowblade in our main hand, 3d8 plus 4 psychic damage, plus an additional 1d4 fire, and an additional 1d4 psychic. We'll get into that in a minute. But it's a finesse weapon, light finesse, so that's why we're able to dual wield it. It doesn't come with any innate bonuses like a +1 to attack rolls or anything like that. It is just pure damage. As well as the fact that you have advantage on attack rolls against lightly or heavily skilled targets while using this blade. Unfortunately, the Shadowblade passive on any weapon it's used on is bugged at the moment, and it's been bugged since the game's release. It just does nothing, unfortunately, which is a bit of a shame. However, it does seem to come with a unique attack called Shadow Strike, allowing you to strike through the shadows and perform a melee attack on an enemy covered in dim light or darkness, dealing a little bit of extra damage, which is nice. So overall, it's a pretty solid weapon. The fact that psychic damage is not very often resisted, unless you're up against something like a Steel Watcher, you're going to be doing a lot with this build, especially if you grab the device in Act 2, which makes it so anyone around you is vulnerable to psychic damage, yada yada yada. You know how it works. Also, here we are with Flameblade, 4d6 fire damage, plus 1d4 fire, plus 1d4 psychic. Again, another light weapon while we're able to wield it, but as you can see, it's not finesse or anything like that, it's just a spell attack, unlike Shadowblade, where it is a weapon attack. But as you can see, we've got pretty decent damage across the board between the two of them, two different damage types. Fire is a bit more often resisted though, which could be an issue. Maybe you want to somehow throw Elemental Adept in here, maybe if you did take the Hair of Antief or blah blah blah, you know the drill. Maybe not making the same mistakes I did, but anyways, but overall, these are going to be two solid weapons to use. Don't have a ranged weapon here, but feel free to throw in whatever you like. There's obviously going to be some useful things out there with just passive buffs, so pick your poison. But anyways, moving on. So for our headgear, of course we're going with the Pyro Quickness hat. This is going to allow us to deal fire damage whenever we deal fire damage with a leveled spell, we burn ourselves and gain an additional bonus action for that round. So just for attacking with our offhand Flameblade, we get to attack again by instantly gaining an extra bonus action, or we can quicken a spell, or use a spell that already takes a bonus action. This is extremely strong. However, there is a big caveat to this, and that is the fact that you burn yourself, meaning that you're going to take 1d4 fire damage every turn. Thanks to our resistance to fire, this is only a maximum of 2 damage, but this is consistent damage that you're going to be taking every turn. And even though we're not very likely to fail concentration checks, sometimes luck just isn't in your favour, so you may want to, somewhere along the line, get a piece of armour that reduces damage by 2 or more. in order to completely nullify this downside. Something like the Flame Enameled Armour. No, not the Flame Enameled Armour. It's the one that Will's father wears. I'll have it in the description for you guys to have a look at. But basically, it's a piece of heavy armor that gives you fire resistance and reduces all incoming damage by 2, and gives you a casting of fire shield, actually. So it's a very on-point piece of armor for this build. But of course, you have to do something pretty evil to get it, and I don't know if anybody would want to do that. But anyways, like I say, you might want to watch out for that, but otherwise, this hat is amazing. It's going to do a lot of things for you, so feel free to pick it up in Act 3. But in the early game, grab the Hat of Fire Acuity. Whenever you deal fire damage, you gain Arcane Acuity for 2 turns. Everyone should know what Arcane Acuity does by this point, because I use it so much on the channel, but it makes it so that every spell, attack roll, and spell save DC gets a +1 for each remaining turn. Because this immediately gives us 2 turns, that's a +2 to our spell attack rolls and difficulty class, which Flameblade absolutely loves, as well as any of our powerful concentration-based, kind of lockdown spells. And the fact that this is a more early game item means that you're going to get a lot of use out of it from the early to mid game, so I would say definitely pick this one up. Next up for our cloak, the Cinder Moth Cloak. A creature that damages the wearer within 2 meters receives burning. So not only are they going to take extra damage from Fire Shield, they're going to be inflicted with the burning condition, basically catching them on fire, dealing fire damage to them every turn, similar to what the Pyro Quickness hat does to us. Next up, the Flawed Helldusk Armor. It says Hellgloom Armor, but it's just the mod that I use to add the equipment uses the early access names. But anyways, the Flawed Helldusk Armor is going to, whenever you are hit with a foe within 2 meters, they might take 1d4 fire damage. So basically, if you get hit with a melee attack, they may take an extra bit of fire damage, fitting on theme with everything that we've got going on here. You also take 1 less piercing damage. This is a really good mid-game armor that is going to work really well for you, looks absolutely gorgeous, and is just going to fit the theme of the build quite nicely. However, like I say, getting a higher level armor, something like the Armor of Agility, or like I say, I can't believe I'm forgetting his names. Will's dad's armor would also work really well for this, or any decent piece of medium armor could also work because of a higher dexterity, so feel free to swap this one out, but this is just a solid piece of armor you can get in the mid-game, and then upgrade later on. Next up, the Flawed Helldusk Gloves. Your weapon attacks deal an additional 1 to 4 fire damage, and your unarmed strikes deal an additional 1d4 necrotic damage, but we don't care about that. This is going to give us an extra 1d4 of fire damage. Again, you're going to get this around the same time you get the armor, but these can be obtained in the mid-game and are going to work really well. You can upgrade these to the full Helldusk Gloves later on if you choose, but for testing purposes I used a lesser version just to see how it would work, and it worked pretty damn well. One thing I will say, actually, though, I didn't know about this, I learned this from the wiki recently, is that these gloves are actually bugged. If you throw a weapon while wearing these gloves, you'll get the extra fire damage, as well as the bleeding that's only supposed to work on unarmed strikes. Curious. Might be something to do with that there. Unless it gets patched. Who knows? And then, but of course, finally we have the Boots of Striding. I know, I use these boots way too often, they're basically the new Nightwalkers, but they are amazing for builds that heavily rely on concentration. Whenever you cast a spell that requires concentration, you gain momentum for 1 turn. Because we're a melee build, being able to get that extra movement speed is going to feel really nice. But while we're concentrating, we cannot be knocked prone or moved against our will. Being knocked prone instantly ends concentration, no matter whether or not you saved from the initial attack. So, being able to prevent us from ever dropping Shadowblade from slipping on ice or being knocked down by a Steel Watcher is actually really important. But otherwise, we do have some other great options, like the Helldusk Boots in the late game, for allowing you to get that kind of Hellcrawler fiery teleport, which is always fun. You ignore the effect of difficult terrain and cannot be moved forcibly by a foe's actions. And whenever you fail a saving throw once per long rest, you can use your reaction to just automatically succeed, so that could help with the important concentration save, so feel free to upgrade to these in the late game. And also there's the Boots of Elemental Momentum. Whenever the wearer deals acid, cold, fire, or lightning damage with a spell or cantrip, so for us, Flameblade attacks, we would gain momentum, giving us more movement speed. Just another fun option that I've never really recommended before. As you already know, our amulet of choice is going to be the Amulet of Greater Health, setting our Constitution score to 23 and giving us advantage on con saving throw checks, meaning that we're very, very unlikely to break concentration on a spell. However, in the early game, something like the Necklace of Elemental Augmentation could also be really good, because it would just give our Firebolt cantrip an extra big dollop of power, in addition to our eventual Sorcerer level 6 feature, adding our Charisma modifier twice to the damage of Firebolt. So it would be a nice way to get a decent ranged attack. Next up, we have the Shadowblade Ring. Now, you may be thinking, Why are we using the Shadowblade ring when we already have Shadowblade? Well, as I've gone on record to state, even though we can upcast the spell version of Shadowblade, it does only last 10 turns, and some people might want something a bit more reliable. So by giving up the upcasting for this version of Shadowblade, you gain it permanently. It's not going to run out after 10 turns, which for some people might be more comfortable. If you don't care about that, swap this out for the Eversight ring to play with darkness when necessary if you don't want to use Shadowblade all the time. But because we are going to be concentrating on Shadowblade quite a lot, we should use the Strange Conduit ring to add an additional 1d4 of psychic damage while concentrating on a spell. So it's just more psychic damage for our psychic damage, but also buffs Flame Blade as well, so no reason not to take it. We got an extra d4 of fire and psychic damage for both of our weapons, which is great. And yeah, that's about it for the build, other than the fact that the die we are using today for this armor set is the Asmodeus die, funnily enough, from the Faerunian Colours mod, available on all platforms. So yeah, that is the build, and overall, as I said, I think it's really, really good. I think there's a lot of room for manipulation of the ability scores and which feats you take. Again, Fey Touch or Shadow Touch would work great on this build, but I just wanted to do something different just to show that you don't always have to go for the optimal option. Again, I totally didn't make a mistake with my feat choice by not realizing that, or forgetting that Shadowblade does not do slashing damage. It does psychic damage, so Slasher doesn't work. Yeah, maybe I rushed this video out a little bit and that's my own fault. But Fey Touch or Shadow Touch will obviously work with that sort of stat allocation. You can also go for things like Athlete as well if you want the extra jumping speed for some reason. Or you could just do the correct thing and use the Hair of RTFL and have a bit more freedom with any feat choice you like. So, you know, mess about with it, play around with it, get this exactly how you want, use the Mirror of Loss to get even more points in places, and turn this build into an absolute powerhouse. I'll be honest, I kind of nerfed this build quite a bit by using things like the slightly lesser versions of equipment and such like that, and it's still absolutely shredded. Yes, sometimes if you get really unlucky, concentration saves can be an issue, but if you're able to get around that, or just find a way to pretty much negate it entirely, you will have a ton of fun. Again, this wasn't originally meant to even include Shadowblade in the build, but it just kind of worked out that it kind of just worked really nicely with it. But if you want to drop Shadowblade altogether and just focus on the Flameblade aspect, maybe using that permanent Flameblade exploit as well to gain 2 Flame Blades, you can go absolutely crazy with this build, hitting people with Searing Smites as well, which would just be insanely powerful. So yeah, feel free to mess around with this as you like. But yeah, that is going to do it for me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.